The Zarkari patrol ship Shadow Fang hovered over the small human outpost on the edge of the galaxy. The crew inside was tense but excited. They had finally found an easy target, a lone elderly human wandering near the abandoned trade station. Commander Veckrel watched from the view screen, his scaled fingers tapping against the metal armrest of his chair. Humans were trouble, but this one. He was old, weak, and alone. No weapons, no armor, no security escort. An easy capture. Move in, Veckrel ordered. The Zarkari soldiers, tall reptilian warriors with sharp claws and glowing yellow eyes, descended like shadows. Their heavy boots clanked against the outpost floor as they surrounded the human. The old man looked up. His face was wrinkled, his hair silver, his eyes a faded blue. He wore a simple coat, hands tucked inside as if he weren't surrounded by armed aliens. "Identify yourself," one of the Zarkari barked. The old man smiled. Veckrel frowned as he watched through his helmet's display. Something about this human felt wrong. He should be afraid. He should be begging for his life. Instead, he stood still, looking at them like they were the ones in danger. "I said, identify yourself." The soldier shouted again, raising his plasma rifle. The human sighed. "I'm just an old man, passing through. You are in Zarkari territory. Humans are not welcome here," Veckrel growled through his communicator. "You will be detained and questioned. If you resist, you will be executed." The old man chuckled softly. He actually chuckled. Veckrel's claws tightened. He didn't like this. Not one bit. "Take him," he ordered. The soldiers rushed forward. They expected the human to resist, to struggle. But he didn't. He let them take him. They bound his hands behind his back with heavy restraints designed to hold the strongest warriors. They pushed him forward, marching him to the waiting transport ship. Even as they shoved him into a cell, locking the reinforced energy bars, the human remained calm. "You've made a mistake," he said. Veckrel stepped forward, glaring at the prisoner from outside the cell. "Is that so?" The old man's smile never faded. His eyes, those faded blue eyes, held something dangerous. "Yes," he said softly, "a very big mistake." Veckrel felt a strange chill run down his spine. But he ignored it. After all, this was just an old man. What harm could he possibly do? The prison transport Shadow Fang roared through hyperspace, carrying its lone prisoner toward the Zarkari high-security detention center. Commander Veckrel sat in the control room, his claws drumming against the table. He stared at the security feed, watching the old human in his cell. Something wasn't right. Most prisoners shouted, begged, or threatened. But this one, he just sat there, relaxed, calm. His hands were still bound, his back against the cold metal wall, but his expression was too peaceful. Veckrel leaned forward and activated the comms. "Who are you?" The old man lifted his head and smiled. "I already told you. I'm just an old man." Veckrel's tail twitched in irritation. "Don't lie to me. There are no records of you in the Galactic database. That is impossible for a human." The prisoner shrugged. "Maybe your database isn't as good as you think." Veckrel's eyes narrowed. Humans don't wander alone on the edges of the galaxy. They travel in groups. They always have a reason. "So tell me, why were you alone?" The human's smile didn't fade. "I enjoy the quiet." Veckrel's frustration grew. This wasn't normal. This wasn't how prisoners acted. He turned to his security officer. "Run another scan. Check his DNA, his fingerprints, anything. I want to know who he is." The officer hesitated. "Sir, we already ran the scans twice." "And?" Veckrel's voice turned sharp. "And what?" The officer swallowed nervously. "His DNA doesn't match any human records." Silence filled the room. Veckrel's blood ran cold. "That's impossible." "No, sir. The results are strange. It says he's human, but he doesn't match any known human. No military records, no birth records. Nothing. It's like he doesn't exist." Veckrel turned his gaze back to the screen. The old man sat there watching him, as if he knew exactly what was happening. The commander felt a rare chill of unease. "Prepare the interrogation chamber," he ordered. It was time to get some real answers. The heavy metal doors of the interrogation chamber hissed open, and two Zarkari guards dragged the old human inside. The room was dimly lit, with a single chair bolted to the floor in the center. The walls were lined with restraint mechanisms, electroshock panels, and truth serums, standard tools for breaking prisoners. Commander Veckrel stood with his arms crossed, watching as the guards shoved the human into the chair. He didn't resist. He sat down slowly, almost like he was sitting in his own home rather than a prison. Veckrel's unease deepened. The guards secured the restraints around the human's wrists and ankles. The metal clamps tightened with a hiss, locking into place with enough force to hold a battle-hardened warrior. Yet the old man didn't even flinch. He just smiled. Veckrel stepped forward, placing his scaled hands on the table between them. His yellow eyes narrowed. "Let's try this again," he said, his voice a low growl. "Who are you?" The human tilted his head slightly. "I already told you," he said, his voice calm. "Just an old man." Veckrel slammed his fist on the table. "Enough of this. You are no ordinary human. No records. No identification. That does not happen by accident." The old man sighed. "Maybe I just prefer my privacy." Veckrel signaled to the guard on his right. The Zarkari warrior stepped forward and activated the pain collar around the prisoner's neck. A small electrical charge surged through it, enough to make most species scream. But the human, he barely blinked. Veckrel's tail twitched in frustration. That was a warning. If you do not cooperate, the next charge will not be so gentle. The old man chuckled. Veckrel's patience snapped. He turned to the other guard. "Administer the serum." The second guard moved to the wall and retrieved a syringe filled with a strong truth serum. The Zarkari used it for breaking the strongest prisoners. Within minutes, it would force anyone to reveal their secrets. The guard jabbed the needle into the human's arm and pressed the injector. Veckrel watched closely. The serum always worked. Within moments, the prisoner would begin speaking, unable to resist the effects. But the human simply sighed, shaking his head. "You people never learn," he muttered. Then, something unexpected happened. The monitor attached to the truth serum began beeping wildly. The guard holding the injector took a step back. "Sir," he stammered, "something is wrong. His body is neutralizing the serum." Veckrel's eyes widened. "That's impossible." The guard tapped at the controls, trying to increase the dosage. But no matter how much serum they pumped into the human's veins, his vitals remained steady. The old man smiled again. "You really don't know what you've done, do you?" Veckrel slammed his hands on the table. "Enough games. Tell me who you are." The human sighed, finally leaning forward. For the first time, there was something dangerous in his eyes. "You really want to know?" he asked softly. Veckrel hesitated. The room felt colder. The old man's presence, once unremarkable, now felt heavy. "Yes," the commander growled. "Tell me." The human's smile faded. His voice became serious. "My name is Daniel Carter." The name meant nothing to Veckrel, but the way the human said it sent a shiver down his spine. "I was a soldier once," Daniel continued. "Long before your kind ever ventured into this part of the galaxy. I fought in wars before you were even born." Veckrel scoffed. "You expect me to believe you are some kind of legendary warrior? Look at you. You're old, weak." "Age doesn't erase experience," Daniel interrupted. His voice was calm, but now there was something hard and unyielding in his tone. Veckrel sneered. "You're still just one man. What could you possibly do?" Daniel exhaled slowly, as if he were tired of explaining. Then, without warning, he pulled his hands free from the restraints. The Zarkari guards froze. Vekral's breath caught in his throat. How? The restraints were made of reinforced titanium alloy, designed to hold creatures far stronger than a human. Yet Daniel had broken free as if they were nothing. The guards reacted instantly, drawing their weapons. But before they could fire, Daniel moved. And then Vekral understood. They had never captured a helpless old man. They had captured a monster in human skin. The silence in the interrogation room was thick, a tense, suffocating thing that pressed down on the Zarkari guards like a vice. Daniel Carter sat there, hands free, calmly rolling his shoulders as if stretching after a long nap. The broken restraints lay in twisted metal pieces on the floor. Vekral's mind struggled to process what had just happened. This was impossible. The restraints were reinforced titanium alloy, designed to withstand creatures with 10 times a human's strength. Yet this elderly man, this fragile-looking human, had broken them with nothing but raw force. Vekral took a step back, his tail curling instinctively. He had interrogated prisoners before. He had tortured warriors, spies, criminals, but none of them had ever done what this human just did. The guards reacted instantly. Their training took over. They drew their weapons, sleek plasma rifles aimed directly at the human's head. One wrong move, and they would fire. Daniel didn't flinch. Instead, he sighed, rubbing his wrists as if mildly inconvenienced. "You Zarkari really don't understand, do you?" His voice was calm. Too calm. Vekral bared his fangs. Open fire. The guards squeezed their triggers. Blazing plasma bolts shot through the air, aimed directly at the old human's chest and head. For a brief moment, Vekral allowed himself to relax. No one could survive a direct plasma blast. Then Daniel moved. It wasn't teleportation. It wasn't some advanced cloaking device. He simply stepped aside, faster than the eye could follow. The plasma shot slammed into the metal walls behind him, burning deep, glowing holes into the structure. Smoke curled in the air. Vekral's stomach turned cold. "No," he muttered. That's not possible." The guards fired again. More plasma shots filled the room. Deadly, precise. But Daniel was already gone. 1 second, he was in front of them. The next, he was behind them. Vekral's eyes barely caught it, a blur of movement too fast for any normal human. Before the guards could react, Daniel struck. His hand slammed into the first guard's throat, a swift, efficient strike that sent the alien crumbling to the floor, gagging for air. The second guard had no time to turn before Daniel grabbed his rifle with one hand and crushed it like paper. The Zarkari warrior's mandibles clicked in panic. He reached for his sidearm, but Daniel was faster. With a single fluid motion, the old human grabbed the alien's wrist and twisted. The bones snapped. The Zarkari screamed. Daniel let him go, letting the alien drop to his knees, cradling his broken limb. The first guard was still choking on the ground. It had taken him less than 5 seconds. Vekral felt his own pulse hammering in his chest. This wasn't a human. This was a predator. Daniel turned to Vekral now, stepping toward him at a casual pace, as if this was just another day for him. Vekral tried to regain control of the situation. "You won't get out of here alive, human," he growled. "This station has over 200 Zarkari warriors. The moment I alert them, you'll be overwhelmed." Daniel tilted his head slightly. 200. He seemed to consider that for a moment. Then, to Vekral's growing horror, he smiled. "That's not nearly enough." Vekral snarled and slammed his fist against the emergency alarm. A loud siren blared through the station, signaling an intruder alert. Every Zarkari soldier on board would be coming. Daniel didn't even glance at the alarm. He didn't care. The old human stepped closer to the table, placing both hands on it, leaning in slightly. Vekral tensed. His claws twitched, ready to strike. Then Daniel spoke. "You really have no idea who you've captured, do you?" His voice was soft, almost pitying. Vekral's breath hitched. Daniel continued, voice low and steady. "You thought you grabbed some helpless old man. A relic from a weak species. Just another human to be interrogated. Veckrel said nothing. Daniel leaned in further. His eyes, those terrible, knowing eyes, locked onto Veckrel's. "I've fought wars," Daniel said. "Wars that make your little skirmishes look like bar brawls. I've seen empires rise and fall. I've ended empires." Veckrel shook his head. "You're lying." Daniel smirked. "Am I?" Suddenly, the station trembled. Veckrel's eyes widened. That wasn't possible. Then came the sound. A deep, distant explosion. Veckrel turned toward the observation window just in time to see a massive warship decloaking outside the station. It was human. Sleek, heavily armed, and it was already charging weapons. Veckrel's blood turned to ice. Daniel turned his head slightly, looking out the window with casual amusement. "Ah," he said, almost fondly. "Right on time." More alarms screamed through the station. A panicked Zarkari officer's voice crackled through the intercom. "See, Commander. A human warship just appeared out of nowhere. It's broadcasting a message." Veckrel's throat went dry. "What message?" The officer's voice shook. They say to release Daniel Carter immediately, or they will erase this station from existence." Veckrel turned back to Daniel slowly. The human smiled. "You never captured me," Daniel said softly. "I let you take me." Veckrel took a step back, his tail lashed behind him, his mind racing. This was not a prisoner. This was a warning. The Zarkari command center was in chaos. Alarms blared across the station. Red emergency lights cast long shadows on the walls, flickering as warning systems overloaded. The once organized command deck was now a mess of panicked officers shouting over one another, trying to make sense of the disaster unfolding before them. Commander Veckrel stood in the center of it all, his claws twitching as he listened to the incoming reports. His scales, usually a dull bronze, were tinged with a pale shade of fear. The massive human warship outside their station was not responding to hails. It was simply waiting. Veckrel turned toward his communications officer. "What do they want?" His voice was sharp, demanding control over the situation. The officer gulped, his mandibles clicking in uncertainty. "They've repeated their demand, Commander. They want us to release the human immediately. If we don't, they will attack." Veckrel's tail lashed behind him. This couldn't be happening. The Zarkari were a warrior race. Their empire stretched across dozens of systems. They had crushed countless enemies before. And yet, right now, Veckrel felt cornered. This was all because of that one human, Daniel Carter. The name meant nothing to him, but it meant something to the humans, something terrifying. Veckrel whirled around and barked at his weapons officer. "How strong is our defense grid?" The officer hesitated. That hesitation infuriated Veckrel. "Well," he snapped. The officer's voice was uncertain. "Sir, the human warship is unlike anything we've seen before. It has advanced shielding, high-caliber kinetic weaponry, and something we can't even identify." Veckrel narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean, something?" The officer tapped on his console, pulling up data. A holographic projection flashed into existence, the human ship's profile. A sleek, dark hull, lined with battle scars but still exuding raw power. Strange energy signatures pulsed along its surface, unlike any known Zarkari technology. The officer's mandibles twitched nervously. "Sir, our sensors are detecting an unknown energy field surrounding their vessel. It's not plasma, not conventional shielding. It's something else, and our systems can't penetrate it." Veckrel's stomach tightened. This was supposed to be a simple interrogation. They had arrested an old human. They had expected a weak, broken creature who would crack under pressure. Instead, they had invited a warship to their doorstep. Veckrel clenched his fists. No, he would not bow to these hairless primates. He turned to his security team. "Prepare the shock troopers. Arm them with heavy weapons. If that human refuses to cooperate, we will force him to. The security chief hesitated. Sir, is that wise? Veckrel bared his fangs. Do you think I need advice, warrior? The chief lowered his gaze. No, Commander. The troops will be ready. Veckrel exhaled sharply and stormed out of the command deck. In the interrogation room, Daniel Carter waited. The two unconscious guards still lay slumped against the walls. The emergency sirens wailed through the corridors outside. Daniel could hear the distant thudding of approaching boots. Heavily armed soldiers. He smirked. Took them long enough. The doors slid open violently, and a squad of 10 Zarkari shock troopers flooded into the room, their armor gleaming under the red emergency lights. Each one carried a heavy plasma rifle, aimed directly at Daniel. A large Zarkari, the squad captain, stepped forward. His voice was gravelly, full of barely restrained aggression. Get on your knees, human. Daniel simply tilted his head. Or what? The captain's mandibles twitched in irritation. Or we open fire. Daniel let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly. You should have brought more men. The captain snarled. Fire. The room erupted in chaos. The command center was silent. Not because there was no noise. Alarms still blared, officers still shouted reports, and the station's automated systems continued to scan the human warship outside. But no one dared to speak. Not after what they had just witnessed. The security feed from the interrogation room had played in real time. Commander Veckrel had watched, along with the entire senior command staff, as one unarmed human dismantled an elite squad of heavily armed Zarkari shock troopers in under a minute. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter. And the worst part, the human had barely tried. Veckrel's claws dug into the armrest of his command chair. His tail was motionless, a clear sign of his rising dread. The room was filled with his officers, his best warriors, his most trusted strategists. And yet, not a single one could find the words to address what they had seen. Then the human had turned to the camera, stared directly at them, and delivered his final warning. Release me, or watch your station burn. A simple message, no shouting, no threats of violence, just a statement of fact. And that terrified Veckrel more than anything. A deep chill ran through him. The human warship outside had done nothing so far. It had not fired a single real shot. Just one warning blast. And yet, that single shot had been enough to disable half of the station's defensive grid. Their weapons officer had confirmed it. If the humans wanted, they could destroy the station in seconds. Veckrel took a slow breath. He needed to think. The Zarkari Empire had fought many wars. They had conquered many species, crushed countless rebellions, and expanded their rule across the stars. But this was not a war. This was something else. The way that human had moved, his unnatural speed, his brutal efficiency, Veckrel had never seen anything like it. And now, that same human was loose inside his station. The officers whispered among themselves. What do we do? One of them asked. If we release him, we look weak. Another muttered. If we don't, we might all die. A third voice added. Veckrel snapped his gaze to the tactical officer. Where is the human now? He demanded. The officer quickly pulled up security footage. The holoscreen flickered, revealing Daniel Carter moving through the station's corridors. He walked calmly. No sign of panic. No sign of urgency. He wasn't running. He was simply walking, as if he already knew nothing could stop him. Zarkari guards attempted to ambush him. It was a disaster. One squad opened fire from behind cover. Plasma bolts blazed through the air. Daniel didn't even hesitate. He dodged effortlessly, twisting his body at angles that should have been impossible. Not a single shot hit him. Then he closed the distance. One soldier was lifted off his feet and slammed into the wall with a single punch. Another tried to strike with a blade. His arm was snapped in two before he even realized what happened. The remaining warriors fled. Veckrel's stomach tightened. This wasn't possible. The Zarkari were warriors. They were stronger than humans, bigger, faster. They had trained for war since birth. And yet, one old human was treating them like insects. Veckrel clenched his jaw. He needed to know. He turned to the intelligence officer. "Tell me everything we have on this human. Now." The officer hesitated. Veckrel's eyes narrowed. "Speak." The officer took a slow breath before pulling up a classified file. Daniel Carter's face appeared on the screen. The information scrolled down. At first, it seemed normal. A human male. Elderly by their standards. Former military background. But then, Veckrel's blood ran cold. There, under the classified section, was a title. A designation known only to the highest-ranking Zarkari commanders. Project BLACKOT. Designation: Spectre. Silence filled the command center. Veckrel's claws tightened on his chair. This wasn't just a human. This was one of them. The Spectres. A name spoken in hushed whispers among Zarkari military officers. A name that had haunted battlefields for decades. The ghosts of war. Humans who had undergone experimental training. Enhancements beyond normal comprehension. One Spectre was equal to an entire army. Veckrel's breath hitched. And they had captured one. Now he understood. Now he realized why the warship outside had not attacked yet. The humans were not afraid of losing Daniel Carter. They were afraid of what he would do if he escaped. If a Spectre was unleashed inside the station, there would be no survivors. Veckrel finally spoke. His voice was hoarse, filled with something he had never felt before. Pure, unfiltered terror. "Open a channel to the human warship." The communications officer scrambled to obey. A moment later, the screen flickered, and the bridge of the human ship came into view. A human captain stood there, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "This is Commander Veckrel of the Zarkari Empire," Veckrel said, his voice tense. We are prepared to discuss terms." The human captain's gaze was cold. "There are no terms, Commander," he said simply. Veckrel swallowed. "We will release your man." The human nodded. "You will. And you will also send a shuttle. Fully fueled. No tracking devices." Veckrel's tail twitched nervously. "We need guarantees," he said cautiously. "That you will not." The human leaned forward. "You don't need guarantees," he interrupted, "because if you try anything, you won't have a station left to argue from." Veckrel felt the threat deep in his bones. The transmission ended. A moment later, a new report flashed across the screen. Daniel Carter was in the hangar, standing beside a shuttle, waiting. Veckrel clenched his jaw. He had no choice. He gave the order. "Release him." As the human shuttle departed the station, Veckrel sat in his chair, staring at the warship outside. And for the first time in his career, he realized something terrifying. The Zarkari Empire had no idea what they had just provoked. The warship did not leave. Even after Daniel Carter's shuttle had safely returned, even after the station had complied with every demand, the massive human warship remained. Commander Veckrel felt the weight of it pressing down on him, a silent judgment from the cold void of space. The humans had their soldier back. So why were they still here? His claws gripped his armrest, his tail motionless. The bridge crew stayed quiet, eyes locked on the massive vessel outside. Then, the human warship sent a transmission. Veckrel hesitated before accepting the call. The human captain appeared again, his expression as unreadable as before. But this time, his eyes held something different. Something dangerous. "You made a mistake, Commander," the captain said. His voice was calm. Too calm. Veckrel forced himself to respond. "We released your man. No harm came to him." The human tilted his head slightly. "No harm. You detained a Spectre. You tried to interrogate him. You thought you had captured just another human." Veckrel's claws dug deeper into his chair. You can't blame the entire empire for a misunderstanding," he said carefully. The human leaned forward. "It wasn't a misunderstanding," he interrupted. "It was arrogance. Your kind thinks it owns the galaxy. You see a smaller species and assume they are weak. But you didn't capture just any human." Veckrel swallowed hard. He already knew what the captain was about to say. "You captured a legend," the human continued. "A ghost from the past. A man who has ended entire wars on his own. And you thought you could put him in a cell." Veckrel felt his throat tighten. The entire bridge was silent, listening. "You're lucky Daniel Carter showed restraint," the captain said. "If he had wanted, he could have turned your entire station into a graveyard. But we both know that, don't we?" Veckrel couldn't respond. Because the human was right. They had seen Carter fight. He had taken down their best warriors without breaking a sweat. If he had truly wanted to escape on his own, nothing would have stopped him. The captain's expression turned cold. "Consider this your one and only warning. The next time your people lay hands on one of ours, there will be no negotiations, no warnings, no mercy." The transmission cut off. Veckrel's chest felt tight, his breathing shallow. And then, the human warship turned. Slowly, majestically, its engines flared to life. It moved away from the station, its massive silhouette vanishing into the void. The Zarkari had been spared. But Veckrel knew the truth. They hadn't been spared because the humans were weak. They had been spared because Daniel Carter had allowed it, and that was more terrifying than anything Veckrel had ever faced. He turned to his officers, his voice low, filled with cold certainty. "Send word to High Command," he said. "Tell them we have made a mistake, a grave mistake, and tell them." His claws tightened. "We must never make it again.